In the realms of the cinematic universes that make up our galaxy, a few films slip through the cracks. Those cracks lead to the deepest, darkest parts of our film culture. They are the bombs. They are disappointments. They are those necessary parts of franchises for a box set that can be skipped at will. And they come right to us.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Jim and Parker's Excellent Podcast, where today we will be reviewing a Bond film.
Excellent!
Unfortunately, it's Quantum of Solace.
Bogus.
And with that, let's get into it. So, Quantum of Solace was released in 2007, coming off the heels of Casino Royale, which arguably is one of the best Bond films of all time, brought Bond into the 21st century with a real bang. And honestly was just a powerhouse. Daniel Craig came in and rocked it and really set the tone for how future Bond films would continue to be produced and made and written going into the future, right up until our most recent one, Spectre, with No Time to Die, supposedly coming out sometime this year, though with coronavirus, we have no idea. With that, Quantum of Solace was produced and released in a very interesting time in Hollywood, and also is an interesting film in general. It's not well received by audiences and critics alike. And on our rewatch, there were a few problems with it. First and foremost, really with the technical side of it, which I will let Jim get into a little bit more here, as he is the more film master than I am, where I just like to comment on things.
So the thing about Casino Royale, especially, I'm going to try to compare it on its own merits, but one of the problems is the camera work is very solid. Mark Forster is a decent director. His problem is with the editing, because the camera work could be very interesting, but they use a lot of what's known as flash cutting, which is very quick edits. It's when you watch like films like The Fast and Furious, it's like quick cut, quick cut, quick cut. But usually action films will allow a shot to run a few seconds because you want to establish geography of action. And this film just doesn't do that, especially in the opening scene, which is a very decent car chase. There's not too much flashy editing going on. But as the film progresses, the action sequences become more and more chaotic, shall we say. And I'm sure that was probably Mark Forster's intention, was to create the chaos of action. But unfortunately, if you don't know where a character is or what's happened to an assailant, pretty much, it becomes extremely confusing, especially in the scene right after the opening credits, which doesn't have a great Bond song, unfortunately. There's an interrogation scene of Mr. White, who carries over from Casino Royale. And the editing, this should be a slow, tense, very kind of patient scene, because it's an interrogation. They're trying to pry the information from him, and he's giving very cryptic answers about what this organization is. But then as soon as things kick off, pretty much, when he's shot, he goes on to survive, we find him in Spectre, spoilers, all of a sudden the editing is like 1 second each, and you don't know what happened to M, because it looks like in one shot that she was wounded, but she wasn't. I had to slow it down. I had to put it on slow-mo to figure out, oh, she actually left the room. Because I was like, wait, where'd M go? It's like, wait, how did Bond get out of there? Like I said, you need geography to understand the stakes and also the environment. And they didn't really quite do that very well. It was all about just trying to move. And by the time the sequence was over, I sort of felt nauseous because of that editing, and it only got worse. Now, sometimes they do take their time and let shots develop, but it's often very weird artistic shots, because Mark Forster is a very artistic art house director, because he's directed like Finding Neverland, Christopher Robin, and he's directed quite a few films that are very artsy, and he's actually much better in that area. He's not very good as an action director. So visually, not Casino Royale. Visually, Quantum is very frustrating on the senses. And as we were discussing in our pre-meeting, the editing I compare it to is the editing of Armageddon, which is also extremely fast, cameras moving all the time, cutting at very random bits, that it's very disorienting. And you can do that with editing. It can lead to great experiences. Unfortunately, in this case, and like Armageddon, it's just not particularly, it doesn't work. And all the flashy editing cannot save a bad script. And that's, I think, where we were both instantly in agreement, was this film has a very bad script.
Yeah, and I think that's where I think the biggest fault with the movie is, because again, I'm always a believer that if you have a great story and everything, it's going to keep the audience attached to the movie throughout the entire 2 hours or 3 hours, whatever you do. With that, I lost interest at the half-hour mark, right after the scene in Vienna where Bond is kind of going rogue, MIA. And with that, just a kind of a little shorthand of the storylines that I saw in there. We have the Bond Vesper storyline, the Bond Dominic Green being the villain of this movie. Bond and M have like their own sort of storyline, like distrust issues going on. Bond and Mathias being from the previous Casino Royale movie who betrayed him, spoiler alert, oops. There is the storyline between the Bond girl who's played by Olga Kurylenko and the general from Bolivia. Felix Leiter and the CIA have like this whole back and forth thing going, along with Bond being tied into it. And then also on top of all of that, which are 6 storylines there, and those are ones that I just caught, I may even have missed a few. There's also this consistent like kind of theme battering around like oil, natural resources, water, like global politics, kind of just like slapped on top of it. And you know, as I kind of told Jim in the beginning when we were discussing this, I'm okay if a movie wants to take a political stance and make that a theme of it. This very much feels like, oh, dictatorships, natural resources, oil, bad. And then it just kind of throws on top. It doesn't really feel like it's well blended in with the story. And I can't really blame that, because there's so much going on here. And along with that also, there are 7 locations that this Bond film takes us to. We start in Siena, Italy. We go to London, United Kingdom. Then we go to Haiti. Then to Austria, which honestly, I even forgot they went to Austria. I know they went to the opera somewhere. I thought they were just like, I don't know, New York City. Then we go back to Italy, then to Bolivia, where we probably spend the most time in this movie in that country. And then it ends going to Russia. It seems like for every storyline that we have here, we have a different like place in the world we're going to. And it's honestly exhausting. And like I said, I lost track after the Austria part, which is the halfway point. And that's pretty bad when a story can't hold you over the halfway point of a movie. And again, I think that's where the biggest piece falls apart with it. Then again, this movie was also written and basically made in a pretty interesting time during Hollywood, 2007.
That's right. So right after Casino Royale came out in 2006, they immediately started developing the Sql Script. And they borrowed the title from Fleming, but that's all it was just the title. Completely original story. But in 2007, anybody who knows Hollywood knows that was one of the writer's strikes, the 2007-2008 writer's strike. And once the strike begun, they couldn't get their writers back. They had the constant mainstays since the 90s. They had Neil Purvis and Robert Wade. And they also had Paul Haggis, who did some rewrites on Casino Royale. And they were developing the initial script. But once the strike happened, they literally could not work on rewrites. And the shooting date was fast approaching. So they had to start shooting. And what I learned was that behind the scenes, if they needed to rewrite something or to add a different scene or add some bits of dialogue here and there, Mark Forster and Daniel Craig would actually serve as unofficial script doctors. And Craig has even said that he's no writer, but it was necessary for them to just write something so that they had something to shoot. And I think that's why the script is so unfocused and so cluttered, was because I think the original intention that their official writers had was kind of lost in translation, and they couldn't further develop it because of just deadlines. And so my issue with when you were discussing the different locations is quintessential Bond. You know, he has to, you know, when some of his films recently have kind of kept him relatively sequestered to maybe 2 locations, which is slightly boring because Bond for years had always gone to the most exotic, amazing locations. And the locations you go to they're great, but I think what you're trying to hint as it just sort of kind of seems like a checkbox, like, oh, we have to do the globetrotting thing, because there's really no point until they get to Bolivia. That's where things kind of coalesce for the story. And even then, it's just kind of like, oh, yeah, okay. But that's also a problem because the villain in this film is not particularly interesting. I mean, the actor Matthew Almeric is really a great actor. I've seen him in other parts. It's just Dominic Green is a very boring villain because there's really nothing to him except he just wants to control the water. It's kind of an evolution of what Bond is, because no longer are Bond villains building lasers and threatening to destroy the world, a la, you know, what Austin Powers makes fun of. They want kind of smaller scale, kind of grounded villains, because Casino Royale, obviously, the villain is just a banker who needs to get out of his bad situation. But even something as simple as that could have, Lashif was extremely interesting. He was very compelling, and he was also a threat. Dominic Green is not a threat. And that's kind of a weakness. But also, again, there's just no focus in the story. You know, M's thing about revenge was because they did a much different vein of revenge in the Bond film License to Kill, which was for a long time was regarded as one of the worst Bond films. It's kind of seen a resurgence in popularity, and actually I liked it as a kid because it had its own revenge angle with Bond and Felix Leiter. And that was much more developed and more interesting. Whereas this one, it just kind of felt like, oh, we need to add an emotional element to Bond, so let's just do that. And on paper, it's a good idea, but again, the paper that they had was not well developed, so they couldn't make hay out of the hay line. What do you think of? And again, before I pass it off to you, I think the characters, their basis was perfectly set up. Their arcs went nowhere, especially Olga Kurylenko really got the short end of the stick with this movie, because her character was the only one I thought could have been more interesting. And she was, again, I'll pass it off to you. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, again, kind of we hinted at, I feel like they tried to throw just everything into this movie just to make it interesting. Like you said, kind of like that fast editing to like throw as much in, as many people, storylines, locations, things like that. And it's just cluttered. It doesn't give the room for the oxygen to get to the fire to let it build up into this great burning story. And, you know, with everything going on, I feel like Dominic Green could have been a cool Bond villain. I'm not saying the best, but like he was menacing. He had like this kind of like sleeky, like snake-like sense to him that he would undercut you a little bit. Like there were moments. The problem is we don't get the time with him or the room in the story to see that develop. And kind of the same with Olga Kurylenko's character. You know, her backstory was interesting. Like there was a revenge theme there and everything. There's just no room for it. I think that's the biggest thing at the end of the day is they tried to cram everything they could into this to make it an interesting Bond film, and it just backfires. It becomes boring, mundane. You don't get to live anywhere in this world. You don't get to be with the characters or see their emotions going through it. It gets really boring, and I think for me that's where it really sticks out.
Precisely.
I feel like also part of that goes back to really this film really deviates a lot from the Bond formula. I think Jim and I were talking about this, that this is the only Bond film in the entire, like, almost like 70 years of Bond, right, Jim? 70?
Uh, no, about coming up on 60 actually.
Excuse me. About 60 years of
There's
Bond.
that.
This is the only Bond film that starts exactly after a previous Bond film. This literally picks up right after the end of Casino Royale in 2006 and kicks right into it. And from that, I think this movie just goes way too far away from the Bond formula, you know? Because the Bond formula has been around for 60 years, it's a very kind of conservative film franchise. They don't like to deviate a lot away from their basic formulas. With Skyfall arguably being the big deviation away from it to make it an Oscar contender, which is a fabulous film. Absolutely love it. And from this film starts right after the original, unlike any other Bond film. There's like the way they kind of introduce Quantum, which was supposed to be related to Spectre, which we would learn later Bond films, is like it's like this other organization that's not connected. It's like, okay, it's either Spectre or it's not Spectre. Like they kind of try to draw this middle line, which doesn't work. There's no real like one true villain in this. There's no like kind of quintessential Bond girl. Like there's kind of like arguments between who was more of the Bond girl, Olga Kurylenko's character or Gemma Arterton's character. It's like it just takes too much away from it. It deviates way too much, and I think that's part of the reason this film failed is because it doesn't stay true to that formula that, you know, is tried and true, but it works.
So I agree with you there, but one of the things too was Die Another Day, and we were talking about this earlier. We saw Die Another Day in theaters because we were raised on Bond. My family, my brother, my mom and dad, we all loved Bond, and so. But Die Another Day, of course, we loved, and you know, as I gotten older, it's a little weaker. But the problem is that it came out after 9/11, so the Bond formula, as it was seen, which was kind of I'd argue that when people think Bond formula, they think of the Roger Moore films, kind of the over-the-top action, kind of silly, outlandish situations. I think because Moore was around longer, that formula became more popular. But after 9/11, that's kind of action. Even in other action films that were coming out at the time, they were re-edited, they were rewritten, because they were like, no, we need to treat this differently. And even the producers recognized that. They said, we need to change. And so when they were trying to develop a new script, they finally got the rights back to Casino Royale. They said, hey, let's restart the franchise. They always say this when they start with a new actor, but they said this time, let's really restart the franchise. That way we can add new things. We could say, this is new. This is a new kind of formula for the next generation. Because that's why Casino Royale really worked, was because it was based on Fleming. It had a lot of elements that have been familiar to fans over the years, but added new things like Bond has a bit of an emotional edge. We see him get hurt. We see he actually has weaknesses, and it was interesting, and it was a great change. And with this, I think they went a little too far, as you said. Like, I remember in the theater, Chris and myself, my brother and I, we were watching it. We were waiting for the gun barrel because the gun barrel hadn't happened, and it was just like, come on, you know, we were waiting through the cinema since 42 seconds of logos. We were like, okay, here we go. No gun barrel. And we're like, huh? That just irked Bond fans to no end. And they did it in Skyfall too, but they made up for it very quickly with a great opening sequence. But Quantum, I think, is more active in rejecting a lot of the Bond formulas. Like when you said there's no definitive Bond girl, well, you're not allowed to say Bond girl anymore. You have to say Bond woman. And
Sorry.
No, I'm kidding. But no, that's coming from the producers. That's not me. They want to develop the female characters, which excellent, good for you. And they actually do that well with Olga Kurylenko. That she is a developed character, but her arc just goes nowhere. And the villains are supposed to be more low key. Like I said, they don't want Austin Powers to make fun of them anymore. So they're going for more realistic villains, like Silva, for example, in Skyfall is a more realistic villain. He's a cyber terrorist. He has a chip on his shoulder from his old boss. That was perfect. And even the way they're treating Spectre now, and even in the theater, Chris and I were saying, like, is this going to be Spectre? And it's like, maybe. It did feel like a precursor, and the way they ultimately revealed it was weak in Spectre, but that's another review for another day. Again, broken story because they wanted to try different things without a cohesive whole. They need a little bit of formula to basically have legs to stand on, and this movie just didn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think really going into my final thoughts about the movie, I had a soft spot for Quantum of Solace for the longest time. Jim knows this because I always defended this movie. Like, it's not as bad as people made it out to be. It gets a bad rep and everything. And looking back on it, this was actually the first Bond movie I saw in theaters. I didn't see, because I wasn't raised on Bond films growing up. I didn't see Casino Royale when it came out in 2006. So this was the first one. And to me, I was like, okay, this is cool. Like, I kind of get, like, now I know who James Bond is. Like, this is kind of fun and everything like that. And I think for the longest time I had a soft spot in it. And then rewatching this, I watched this last night, and I just saw all the problems, and I'm like, oh boy. It's like, I had to take off the nostalgia glasses and be like, oh buddy, I'm sorry. And I hate to say it, but like, that is kind of what it is. And for me, this movie is so similar, and this is an interesting comparison. This movie, to me, when I was watching it, reminded me so much of Mark Webb's Amazing Spider-Man 2, because it like falls into so many of the same pit traps. You have a high-level character that fans around the world love, but you try to cram in so many storylines. The editing was kind of all over the place. There were so many characters and villains. You didn't really know what was going on or get a chance to really be there and be in that environment with them. I think where Amazing Spider-Man 2 kind of won over Quantum of Solace is that it was all in New York City, whereas Quantum of Solace, like we said, we jump around so much, it's disorienting to know what environment we're sitting in. And at the end of the day, I have a soft spot for Amazing Spider-Man 2. I don't think it's the worst Spider-Man movie out there, which I will, like, I'll have the argument and everything, because, like, it's definitely an argument to be made. But I have a soft spot for it, just kind of how I still have a soft spot for Quantum of Solace. I think back on it with fond memories of this being James Bond. And so for that, it's not as good as I remember it, I will fully admit. With that said, though, there were a lot of things I did like. I thought there were a lot of cool sets and set pieces, like the hotel at the end was really cool. Them starting in Siena, Italy with the Palio, which I have been to in real life, and they capture the energy of that race to a T. It's awesome. If you ever get the chance to go, it's every July 2nd, I believe. So if you're ever in Italy in the summer, make a trip to Siena. It's worth it. Also, I really liked how Bond was done in this one, because, like, Bond really does feel like a chameleon in this film. Like, everywhere he goes, no matter he's jumping around all these different places, he really is able to fit in with wherever he goes, which is like a spy is supposed to do. You're supposed to be able to fit into different scenarios. And with that also, I thought Daniel Craig in this movie was still good. Daniel Craig's an awesome actor. And with that, he showed a different Bond than Casino Royale. This Bond was much colder and callous, and you can kind of see that following after Casino Royale and with Vespa betraying him, that he's very cold. Like, he doesn't have a lot of emotion to the world. He feels like everything around him was kind of like cut off, which was like one of the most vulnerable scenes in Casino Royale, where like Bond opening up to Vespa was the most vulnerable thing he ever did, and he feels like his heart has been wrenched out because of that. And Daniel Craig wears a lot of that emotion on his face. So overall, those are my kind of final thoughts. Jim, like, what are your final thoughts on it?
So you just hit on something that, because I think I told you, the worst thing a Bond movie can do for me is bore me. And this movie is boring. So that's why I consider it to be the worst. Now, I have a lot of other Bond films that I despise. I despise Diamonds Are Forever. I really don't like For Your Eyes Only. That movie's also boring. This one, it was just too much of a mess. The other two, they have at least coherent plots. This one just didn't. But the one thing that it did have was Daniel Craig. Now, a lot of people were really suspicious of Daniel Craig before Casino Royale came out. You know, he was blonde, he was kind of small compared to like Sean Connery and everybody, you know, because Bond, described by Fleming, had dark hair. And everybody made issue that he was blonde. It was just like, it was one of the silliest things. Now, of course, Casino Royale comes out, and he established himself as one of the best Bonds. You know, I think he's just slightly second to Sean for me, because I think Sean Connery just stuck the landing so well. And in this movie, he makes it watchable, because Craig, again, like you said, it's a natural progression from Casino Royale, but his motivations seem to kind of get lost in the mayhem. That's the problem. And he has great chemistry with Olga Kurylenko. She got really shortchanged in this movie. I feel really bad, because also there was a sequence that perfectly exemplifies what the potential was for the movie. It was the scene where they take the DC-3 and they're flying over the site, and they get into the fight with the fighter and the helicopter in a DC-3. My mind, because you know, I love old World War II planes. When I saw the DC-3, I was like, yes, this is gonna be great. Bad editing. I was like, but you have these amazing aircraft. Why aren't you showing them? You know, the editing was just so terrible. Like, you couldn't catch where you were. No sense of geography, which all the other Bond films did perfectly. You knew where you were. You knew what was going on in space. This just didn't. And again, I'm trying to. When I approached this rewatch, I just wanted to try to be kind, because unfortunately, it's sandwiched between the two best Bond films, Casino Royale and Skyfall. But it just didn't pay off for me, and it just reminded me of how frustrating it is to really watch. Now, with that said, the things I love Daniel Craig. I really like the score by David Arnold, who's really underrated. I think the ending, kind of the quiet note the ending hit on, was actually quite nice. Again, it comes from David Arnold's wonderful score and Daniel Craig's acting. But if I was to really rank this, like, even knowing, like, watching Spectre now, like, reevaluating all the series, this still, for me, is the worst Bond, because it has so much wasted potential. And even the worst Bond films had something. It was just like, okay, this just, to me, was empty, when it tried to be much more fulfilling. Like, all the stuff they threw in, it just came out empty.
Yeah, I agree. Like, and my final thoughts, I guess, you're right, Jim. This movie had all potential. If I was to kind of like rework this, looking at the storylines and everything like that, I would have taken out the Bond and M storyline that was going on there. I would have taken out the stuff with the CIA and like the kind of like the heavy hand oil, like natural resource political stuff. Again, it just feels slapped on. It doesn't feel like it's putting with consideration. And I really would have made this a story about like revenge, because I think that was like the one theme they were trying to go throughout with this. And I think it would have been really interesting to have a story where Bond is trying to get like revenge for Vespa, in some sort of sense, and then also pair that in with Olga Kurylenko's character trying to get revenge against the general, and then Dominic Green kind of like tying in with all that because he's the piece of it. Now, again, like that's still 3 storylines. That's a lot going on there. I understand that, but I feel like that's 4 storylines taken out right there. Like,
Yeah.
that at least slims it down, and it gives you back at least like, I don't know, 30 minutes of screen time in order to redevelop the characters, let them sit with you a little bit more, maybe cut out a location or 2, because again, like we don't even get to sit in those environments long. For me, that's what I would do. Again, I'm not a screenwriter, director, or anything like that, but you know, just looking at the strategy of crafting a film, I think you just need to do that. And I'm not sure if I would rank this as the worst Bond film. It's definitely towards the bottom, though. I can't deny that. Even with nostalgia glasses taken off and everything, I can't deny this movie's bad. It's which sucks because I have a very nostalgic view of it. But looking back on it, I can't deny
Yeah,
that.
I remember when I was in the theater, we got out and I thought it was good. But then when I rewatched it over the years, it was like it just kept getting not even slowly diminishing like some other Bond films. It just kind of felt like block knocked off, just kept going, just deeper. And you actually, what you hit on was quite smart. Is if you cut out all the extraneous stuff and kept it as a simple, the through line is revenge. Again, it's perfectly set up. Bond is looking for revenge for Vesper. Olga Kurylenko is seeking revenge on the general, and the general and Dominic Green could have tied in very well if they kept it at that. Instead, they just threw in too many contrivances and twists and turns that it all got lost. And when it kind of tried to come together at the end, again, empty.
So
that actually is a smart approach if you were a screenwriter, is to have a parallel story between your Bond girl and Bond, and have that sort of in a tangent with Dominic Green. Again, they could have developed that beautifully. It could have been one of the better sequels to Bond, but alas, it didn't happen that way.
So what would you give this film as like a final ranking, Jim? 1 through 10, A through F, what would you give it?
Oh boy. I give it a D- because again, it's watchable in a sense, because you want to follow Craig because he's such a magnetic Bond. But I don't want to give it an F because because there's worse movies out there. But just D- because it was all perfectly set up for us after Casino Royale, and it just poof.
Yeah, I would have to be inclined to agree with you. I like D-, D. Again, it has a soft spot for me, but looking at all the faults and everything, it's like they're just too great to overlook. So I agree with you. I think that's a pretty fair review of that.
Now, with that said, we have to give this movie credit because it showed the producers that, okay, we can't rush these things. We have to really sit back, look at what we're trying to do, and pick a better creative team. They brought, now after the strike ended, the writers were back, and they brought Purvis and Wade back to write Skyfall, and they also brought on John Logan, who wrote The Aviator. And they realized, they said, yeah, we want to tell a more emotional story, but how do we make that work? And if you watch Skyfall, that is how you make it work. You develop your writer, you get a director who may be artistically inclined like Mark Forster, but who also has a decent sense of action. And a lot of people didn't know that Sam Mendes did until he did Skyfall. And, you have a much better cinematographer in Roger Deakins for Skyfall. You have a much better editor in Stuart Baird, who they didn't bring back for Quantum, and it was a big problem. So Quantum of Solace is one of the more important Bond films. It's kind of like there's a couple of Bond films over the years where they really had to pause, look at the forest instead of the trees, and say, okay, how do we fix this? So it was important. We needed it. So,
and it did give us Skyfall, which is one of the best Bond films of all time. I feel like that'll be another fun one for us to do one day. And then
we have decided one of our podcasts down the line is going to be Spectre versus Skyfall.
Yes,
because you pretty much have the same creative team, and how one can be so great and one can go very wrong. So that's going to be coming up sometime in the future.
Yeah. I feel like my final thought is we had Casino Royale, we had Quantum of Solace, we had Skyfall, we had Spectre. So here's hoping that if we're following the same pattern, that No Time to Die is going to kick ass, because we've been waiting for this film for so long, and we cannot wait to see it.
If No Time to Die ever reaches theaters, that in itself is a fascinating story of how this movie just can't catch a break.
Die. That's it. No Time to Die just can't die.
No Time to Die has no time to die. It just keeps going. So we'll see.
So with that, that concludes our episode today. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Once again, I'm Parker Glazner.
I'm Jim Crowley.
And we will see you next time on Jim and Parker's Excellent Podcast.
Whoa.